Sorry. Let me just say a few words about economic growth and inequality in the area that will be covered in this paper. After the fall of the communists in 1991, all these countries started a transition from central planning to market economy. And the last decade of the 20th century was characterized by a complete breakdown of trade links among the former Soviet republics, high inflation rate, in some area also increase in mortality, infant mortality rate, as probably you know, disappearance of many state-owned enterprises, and so on, even armed conflicts. At the beginning of the 21st century, there was a beginning of a recovery, among other reasons because of important inflows of foreign direct investment, at least in some of the countries, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, which are rich in natural resources. Also, there were important remittances from migrant workers from Armenia, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan. But after 2014 and the sharp drop in international commodity price, there was slowing growth, also a slower growth in Russia. This affected the growth in this country. Despite diversity, this country have a certain number of common features, the most important one being that they all went from centrally planned economy to market economy. All right, why don't I skip, this, some additional data I have here. What I do in this paper is, from a methodological point of view, is to propose an alternative way of measuring standard living, which is not based on income, but on durables, or more generally on assets. This is not the first time, such an approach has been suggested. Actually, it started a long time ago, about 15 years ago. And before I give you a general introduction to this topic of asset approach to measuring standard of life, the database we are using is the Life in Transition Survey, which is a survey which is done by the European Central Bank. And it covers, we work with 3 years, 2007, 2010. Actually, I forgot to say two things. First, that there are 3 co-authors to my paper that you saw on the first page, Wang Guowan, Joseph Deutsch, and Yongsheng Xu. And also that for the year 2006 and 2010, we had done some work, at least some of us, not the 4 of us, but some of us, for the Asian Development Bank, but this paper extends this to 2016. All right. Now, what the idea of measuring standard of living via assets is simply first related to some theoretical basis for this, that consumption is a function of wealth, and it is probably better measured than income. There are less missing value and less under or even over reporting. So Filmer and Pritchett are the one who introduced this asset approach to measuring standard of living, but they use principal component analysis, and there have been many applications of this approach to education, to health, to child nutrition, and so on. The idea, the first axis of the principal component is assumed to refer to wealth because it has the highest level of discrimination between the household. Now, there are other approaches, correspondence analysis, which I think one paper in this conference used, correspondence, or will, I don't remember whether, I wasn't here yesterday, maybe the paper was presented yesterday, uses correspondence analysis, item response theory, and an approach which we could call the most common order of acquisition of durable goods, which is an idea which was introduced by my former colleague Parouche a long time ago in a paper in Econometrica. So we are going to use item response theory and also this, what I call the Parouche approach. Now, item response theory, as many of you must know, is a very common technique in psychometrics. The idea being that when you measure in all these psychometric tests, you want to measure the intelligence of the individual, but you don't really measure intelligence. You have a proxy for this, like answers to all kinds of questions in the test. And so item response theory, which ends up with a kind of logistic curve, has a certain number of parameters. I don't have time to go into detail, but what's interesting, it has been applied in the starting in the 80s, originally actually by a specialist of education, Professor Jacques, who was at Luxembourg, but he died a few years ago, and later on by several economies, the idea being that the same thing as we cannot measure intelligence, we cannot measure poverty. We have proxy for poverty, but poverty is a latent variable. Hence the idea of using item response theory. Now, what the idea of the order of acquisition of durable goods that my colleague Parouche, who was inspired by a famous social scientist named Goodman, here you have a simple example. Let's assume there are 3 durable goods that are called D1, D2, D3. And here you have all the possible combination of ownership of durable goods. Either you don't have any. The fourth one, either you don't have any, or you have 1 good, you have 2 goods, or you have 3 goods. And you have this, the same thing, 5, 6, 7, 8. So you have actually 2 to the power 3 possibilities of owning these durable goods. Now, let's assume there is an order of acquisition. And for simplicity, let's assume you first acquire D1, then D2, then D3. Obviously, we don't know. We have to find out in which order we acquire the durable goods. But if it is the way we acquire the durable goods, then the only profiles which are possible are profile 1, 2, 3, 4. Either you don't have any good, or you have D1, or you have D1 and D2, or you have D1, D2, and D3. The other profiles are not possible. So the question is, how am I going to find out what's the most common order of acquisition durable goods in population? So actually, what we do is, you first measure the distance. Let's assume somebody has, let me go back to this table, let's assume somebody has good 1, but he doesn't have good 0, has good 2, he doesn't have good 1, doesn't have good 3, which is profile 6, I think. And let's assume the most common order of acquisition is D1, D2, D3. Then we can compute the distance of this individual from this most common order of acquisition, and the distance, obviously, it is going to be 2 because he doesn't have 0, he doesn't have D1, he doesn't have D3, so his distance, one of the possibility of measuring distance is 2. And you can do this for every individual, for every possible order of acquisition. Then you can weight. There will be several people with the same profile. You compute I think somewhere I have the formulation here. You can compute the weighted distance, the distance from 1. This is what's called the reproducibility index R, which was defined by Gutmann, as I said before. And then you take into account all the possible order acquisition, and for each individual you compute for each order acquisition the distance. It's a huge computation, but with computers and with a course like Joseph Deutsch, my close friend Joseph Deutsch, you can do it today. I cannot do it. So, for example, for Armenia in 2016, data we use, there were 1,518 people, or individuals. So you have, for a given order acquisition, since you have 9 goods, you have 10 possibility, and how many possible order you have is factorial 9, and then the total number you end up is, I don't know, something like 5 billion, 500, and so on. But you can find at the end what's the most common order of acquisition. And this is what we have done in this paper. So that's the first point I want to make. Second point we do is given we found out what the most common order acquisition is, we can compute an index of inequality, because some people will have 0, some people will have 1 good, 2 good. Obviously, once we limit ourselves to the most common order, we do not cover the whole population. But usually the most common order acquisition covers something like 40 to 50% of the population. And then we are going to use this information to compute not regular inequality indices, but ordinal inequality indices, because when you have ordinal information, you cannot really use a Gini index, Hiley index, or whatever. You have to use special indices, which have been introduced during the past 10 or 15 years in the literature, mostly on health inequality in the field of health, because in health, usually people are asked, how do you rate it's a self-assessed health. How do you rate your health? Very bad, bad, and so on. And people have been working in this field and proposed several indices of ordinal inequality. You have the formulation here, you have them in the paper, so I'm not going to spend time on this. The second thing we do also, that's a recent paper I wrote with Benedicta Pouet and Yongsheng Su on measuring welfare when you have ordinal variables. This measure, the paper was recently published in Review of Income and Wealth. This measure was axiomatically derived by one of my co-authors, Yongsheng Su. We had some idea before, and he's a specialist in axiomatics, I'm not. And he derived a measure of welfare when you have only ordinal information. And here you have the formulation. Again, I'm not going to spend time on this. You have it in the paper. So let's go look at the results of our analysis. We had actually 9 goods: dwelling, access to tap water, telephone, access to gas, car, second house, bank account, computer, access to internet, and data for 2006, 10, and 16 for a certain number of countries. You're going to see them in a second. And we apply both the Paresh approach and item response theory. Let me, for example, show you what the most common order acquisition is in the different countries for each of these years. Just taking a quick look, you can see that they are quite similar, but I'll give you some correlation in a second. And here is what we have when you have item response theory. Because item response theory, also you have these curves, and when you take the middle at 50%, you have logistic curve between 0 and 1. You draw a line, a horizontal line at 0.5, and you have some order, and this is the order of acquisition, implicit order acquisition that item response theory gives you. Now let me show you correlation. First, between country ranking correlation, they are very high. Whether you use the Paresh approach, the item response approach, this is for 2006. Most of the time it's above 0.9. This is for 2010. Here, sometimes for some country like Tajikistan, it's low compared to other countries, but many times it is high. In 2016, again, besides Tajikistan, maybe Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan, the correlation are high. Then we computed correlation between 2 approaches, the Paresh approach and item response theory. For each of the year in each of the country, you can see all the numbers are above 0.95, I think. So it doesn't really matter whether you use item response theory or the Paresh approach. Maybe it is simpler item response theory because you have programs in Stata which have item response theory. And then there are correlation between years using the Paresh or the item response theory for each country. So you can see 2006 and 10, or 2006 and 6, 2006 and 10 is only 4 years, very high correlation. 2006 and 16 is quite distant, so correlation are above 0.7 most of the time, but it's a bit lower. And 2010, 16 also they are very high. So you can see that there is probably some, although maybe in traditional economics we don't like the idea, but there is probably some order of need or something like this. There is an order in which we acquire the different assets. All right. Now what we did in order to compute the ordinal inequality indices, we use the Paresh approach here in the illustration, but we can use item response theory too. We have in each country in year for the percentage of people who do not have any asset, we have 1, we have 2, we have 3, we have 9. Now if you take a look, compare 2006 and 10 and 16, you can see the percentage of people who do not have any asset decrease, which is a first sign that wealth increase. The other sign, if you compared 8 and 9, 9 is 100%. So the difference between the column of 9, column and 8 has to do with what percent of people have the 10th good, or the 9th good, sorry, because it's 0, it's only 9th good. And if you would compute the difference, I forgot to put it, you will see also that there was an increase in wealth. So here we have the ordinal inequality indices. Here we have a certain number of indices. The Reardon index, which actually is the same as the was originally introduced in a paper on ordinal segregation, but it's the same issue. and an index proposed by Hadbul, Naga, and Yalcin, and indices derived axiomatically by Yongsheng Su and two co-authors. I will not pronounce their name because I'm not able. So you can see an increase in inequality over time in most of the countries, not in all, but in most. And this is what we have when we have item response theory. So for example, inequality was highest in 2006 in Kazakhstan and lowest in Tajikistan, was highest in 2016 in Georgia, and again lowest in Tajikistan. And if we go to the change in inequality over time, that depends on the country. There's generally an increase in inequality, but not everywhere. Then we computed what we said the welfare index, which we derived in a paper on health inequality, recently. And we can see that generally there was an increase in welfare. Now, pay attention that when in the third column, when alpha tends toward 1, because this index is like a little bit the Atkinson index, because it increases with the average, but it decreases with inequality. And when alpha tends to 1, the parameter, I don't give you the formulation, it doesn't take into account inequality. So the column alpha tends to 1 shows you pure growth, not taking into account inequality, and you can see there was pure growth. There was an increase in the standard of living over time. When you have a lower value for alpha, it takes into account inequality. For example, alpha 0.5, you can see that even when you take into account inequalities, there was an increase in welfare during these 10 years. All right, so how many more? 1 minute?
2 minutes.
2 minutes, okay. So what can we observe? As I said, welfare increased in both sub-periods for all countries except Uzbekistan, where it increased only during the first sub-period. And this conclusion holds whether we assume that alpha is 0.9 or 0.5. And now the last thing we did is, although it's really not a real statistical test, but I wanted to use, since we have data on the per capita GDP in some of these countries, and the Gini index, not on all the country, we computed not the Atkinson index, but the Gini-related welfare index that was introduced by Sen, if I'm not mistaken. And so we have also a welfare measure, which is the per capita GDP times the average capita GDP in the country times 1 minus the Gini index, because I said welfare is a negative function of the index. And then I compare the ranking of per capita GDP and our index, welfare index when alpha tends to 1. And then I compared, let's say, the Gini index and the Bar-Ilan index. And then I compared the equally distributed level of per capita GDP using the Gini index with our index, which is Apue and co-author index. You can see that, I mean, there are only, 7 observations for 2 countries. We do not have inequality. So it's just to take a look. There is quite a lot of similarity. So it seems, although it's not a proof, that we can use data on asset not only to measure inequality, but also to try to measure welfare. So I think I'm not going to go back to what I said before, so I will stop here.
Thank you very much, Jacques. Thanks a lot for exactly staying on time. We have a discussant. I think Yulia Lezhina, you're there.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I'll just say a few words and some maybe ideas for further development or something. Of course, it is not easy to measure wealth or welfare. By the way, it is much more difficult to measure welfare than wealth. And income is not a way, you have already told that. Currently, in modern life, there are much more inequalities that matter besides income inequality. So we talk about inequality in education and the access to education, job and opportunity to look for and find this or that kind of employment, housing, so on and so forth. So if we talk about a number of different kinds of important inequalities in modern world, we see that different services matter. You decided to choose assets themselves, so something that a little bit different and goes somewhere near. And it's a quite good, from my point of view, indicator for measuring wealth. It's something that you collect, and doing it day by day. If we talk about welfare, we deal with some kind of opportunities and circulation of this and that goods. So it goes about something of different nature. So not asset itself, but opportunities maybe mostly. But anyway, you're right. When you choose this or that approach and this or that indicator, we have to deal with limitations. And the reason is, if these limitations are too high and too important and they are too limiting or not. The indicators you use, by the way, you have a brilliant data, frankly speaking, when you have a chance to look, to observe how people try to collect different kind of goods, durables. It's not easy to collect that kind of data, and the access to this data is very interesting to have. But the goods you analyze, you observe are quite different. And for me, for example, especially if we remember the list of countries that you study, that you research, it's quite difficult to imagine the everyday life, the scene of life that goes under this or that combination of these durables. So if we talk about, for example, access to medicine, access to higher education, access to employment on a positions with higher education or something, it tells me much more about the everyday position, the everyday life of these people. And this is the issue. What do we measure? So you have a brilliant methodology that is developed on the base of other works. But at the same time, we have to answer, what do we measure? Is it wealth? And what kind of wealth? And do we have a chance to compare? So, of course, the practice of measuring welfare and wealth with a number of indicators about opportunities and different kinds of goods is very rich. And we can observe that different methodics, when we take different data from different countries, they have to be have to be adopted somehow. For example, when we talk about American lifestyle and standard of living and the welfare itself, is it good or bad? It's some kind of median. So it's one thing. We can talk about number of cars for the family. We can talk about durables like French fries maker or something. By the way, in Russian Academy of Science, in Institute of Sociology, they had a research on measuring standard of living. And for a long period of time, it's already finished, but anyway, one of the pieces, one of the elements of this welfare state basket was carpet itself. Carpet, which seems quite strange, for example, right now. Carpet, that the cover on the floor.
Oh, yeah.
So it's not like here right now, but even 7 years ago, it was like that. And it was the piece of everyday life for the majority of Russians. That's why the culture issues and the standards of living, they matter. And even for your sample, for your countries, it is necessary to answer the question if we have a chance to compare these countries with this set of goods that we measure, that we observe. Another thing that I was thinking about, reading your paper and listening to you, that we measure something for something. If we measure welfare, it is better to have an idea what do we do further with this data and these results. So in this way, we can think about some social policy issues. We have poor wealth. We have a welfare of the kind like less than half of the population is living good enough. Or we have a very sharp inequality and we have to do something with that. It's one thing and one set of indicators for measuring wealth and welfare. If we talk about social polity in terms of opportunities to develop the country, if we talk about the opportunities of population to get the education, to get the medical help of a certain kind, then we have another set of indicators of measuring wealth. That is why if we just number something around opportunity to get water inside the house and the second house at the same list among 9 elements, 9 indicators of welfare, we have to realize what further, what can we do with this indicator of welfare? How can we use it? And it was my question for your research right now. I'm involved in the social policy issues. That is why maybe you can answer. But still, from my point of view, these indicators are much, they stand quite far from each other. And the welfare that is measured provides no clear scene, no clear image of a certain group that has this or that level of wealth, and again, it is not understandable sometimes what sharp, high or low inequality of this kind of wealth or welfare can lead to. Is it a problem or not, and what kind of a problem it leads?
Thank you very much, Yulia. I'll give a few minutes to Jacques to respond to your rather philosophical question, and then we'll open the floor for the Q&A.
Thank you very much for your remarks. I must say that I agree with all of them, actually. I worked a lot on multidimensional poverty, so I totally agree that welfare depends also on education, on health, and so on. Maybe we should be more careful in the labeling and maybe call it material wealth-related welfare. We use welfare because that's the way in Atkinson and Serge Colme used to call it. Your remark concerning the impact of difference in culture, I also agree. I have never been very fond of growth equation which work with cross-section of countries, and I didn't do we didn't do regression, but we certainly should be maybe careful and mention this importance of culture. And thank you for your third type of remarks, that we should say a few words about policy implication. Thank you.
Okay, let's go to questions, comments. Okay, well, if nobody has a question, let me ask one. I was interested in the last table that you showed. I couldn't actually understand everything, but the ranking you said according to the different measures that you were using, and the ranking according to the SEN index are very similar, you said. And do you remember what would be like, it seemed to me Kazakhstan like a number one was, do you remember the countries? I'm just curious for
I am very bad in remembering, so we should...
Okay, and we,
I don't
it
remember.
is...
Can you put it again? Silber, it's in the...
I would just like to see the order. I'm curious.
The second line and the second to the right, yeah.
See, we are overly efficient. We already moved to the next presentation.
Here. So what did you say?
Well,
Kazakhstan?
I would just like to, if you could just give us very briefly, like the order in terms of welfare that you find for the 5 countries, because the 2 of them I think you're missing.
Obviously Kazakhstan, actually, I skipped this data, but there was a huge difference in 2006, I think, between the per capita GDP of Kazakhstan, which was 17,000, obviously, because of the oil, right? And Tajikistan, I think, which was 3,000 or 4,000 or something like this. So you have it here also. Kazakhstan is first. When you take only growth into account, right? Alpha 0.9 or mostly growth, well, 0, it's not 1, it's 0.1. If you take alpha equal 1, which is pure growth, then Kazakhstan is first, at the 3rd column or the 2nd column, okay? And the poorest is Tajikistan, which is...
And if you take the,
if you take
inequality?
Inequality into account, you have Kazakhstan, well, some data are not available on Gini for Azerbaijan and Uzbekistan, but Kazakhstan is the richest, even taking into account inequality, because growth was very, very important. I mean, more higher impact than inequality. And Tajikistan is the poorest.
No, I think it would actually sort of rhyme with what would be our general sort of impression of the countries. The ranking would actually reflect what we sort of think about the countries. Any questions on